Hello, welcome to Steel City Business, the Sheffield business podcast. I'm James Marriott. I'll be your host as we explore the vibrant business scene of the glorious city of Sheffield. Now, in each episode, we meet someone from across the Steel City to learn more about them and, of course, their business. I run my own business. It's called Sound Media, and it's all about helping brands to amplify their voice through audio marketing. If you want to find out more, then head to the show notes. There's more information there. And this podcast is supported by the lovely people at The Curious, creative agency in the centre of Sheffield. Now, if you'd like to get in touch with us, maybe to suggest a guest or for any reason, then there are contact details in these show notes, or head to steelcity.business. Right, that's enough of that. Let's meet our guest.
Hi, I'm Nick Tyrone. I'm a journalist and author, and I'm also the Senior Policy Advisor at the Jobs Foundation, which is the organisation through which I've done this project.
Nick, thank you very much for joining us on Steel City Business. This feels like a slight kind of change to what we would normally do. Normally, we're meeting business owners, we're talking about things that are going on within the business community in Sheffield. A little bit different this week because, firstly, you're not in Sheffield. You are down in the south of the country, and you are joining us through the joys of technology today for this chat. But there is a reason for that. So you've spent a bit of time in Sheffield because you've been writing a report. Tell us a bit about that.
The first thing I should probably do is introduce the whole project and the Jobs Foundation just a little bit. So the Jobs Foundation is a very new charity, and it's set up to basically champion sort of jobs as the route out of poverty and business as a societal good. So it's trying to look at the things that businesses do that are positive and really, just try and look at not just the good that they do through their actual day-to-day business, but other things that they might do in the community, that sort of thing. So what we decided early on in the project is we were going to look at various parts of the country, and we wanted to focus on a particular city, a particular town, a particular coastal community, although we did end up looking at a host of coastal communities and a rural community. And the city that we decided on was Sheffield. We did that for a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons that we came to is we looked at Manchester, we looked at Leeds, we looked at a few options. We looked at Birmingham, but we felt like Sheffield was a little bit under talked about. Just, we felt like it was a bit fresher. So, and we also, in a practical sense, we had a couple of people that we knew in Sheffield, which would sort of ease the start of the project. So in January, that was my first trip up to Sheffield. Basically, I just got all my ducks in a row. I had a whole bunch of mostly business owners at that point, people who were running their own SMEs, and they could be SMEs of, sort of 100 staff. They could be very, very tiny SMEs of, 3-4 people. So I went up to Sheffield for 3-4 days, and I basically just went around and interviewed people. I used those initial contacts to talk to other business people that, I sort of used my initial contacts to get other contacts. And my aim was just to speak to as many people as I possibly could do. And I spoke to other people. There's other people highlighted in the report, which I'll come on to. But the main focus was businesses and really mostly SMEs, because that was sort of one of the things I wanted to focus on in the report, just generally. But and so when I would speak to the business owners, what I would say just generally is, how do you think business is going? What are the positives and negatives that you feel you're facing at present? I also wanted to know, one of the focus on the report is on jobs. So I wanted to know about things like, their hiring practices, their training practices. Do they use apprenticeships? Just because one of the things the report's trying to do, amongst other things, is sort of map best practice for those particular things. So what we can learn from actual businesses on the ground. And yeah, what I found in Sheffield was very enlightening. And actually, I'm really glad I started with Sheffield as opposed to some of the other areas that I went to, simply because actually I didn't know what I was going to find in Sheffield. I was really impressed, for instance, with the tech sector in Sheffield. I mean, I kept it completely open minded to know what I would find, but I was really quite pleasantly surprised by how active it was. The sort of things I found, young people, actually doing pretty well for themselves. And that was nice. That was really that was really good.
That's awesome. I think it feels, as someone who is in Sheffield, has been in Sheffield for a long time, this is that I class as my city. It does feel like exciting times at the moment, but there are definitely challenges. So I think it's going to be interesting to kind of pick through some of your findings. Before we go any further, so had you had experience of Sheffield before? Is it a place that you knew? Had you even been to Sheffield before this?
I had been to Sheffield one time, and it was about 20 years ago, and it was for a stag do, and it was for a stag do for someone. It was for a stag do for someone I didn't even know that well. So that was my entire Sheffield experience up to this point. Sort of rolling in for about 48 hours, spending most of it in a sort of drunken haze, and leaving. So my experience of Sheffield was extraordinarily thin on the ground.
It sounds like you probably had a fun time the first time around, so that's good. That's good. So I know sometimes it's quite difficult to kind of think back. Obviously, you're talking 6 months since you kind of came here and started working on this, but can you remember kind of what your maybe preconceptions, what you expected to find in Sheffield? What the image in your mind about what kind of city it was, kind of what that looked like?
I guess I probably expected, like, in particular with some of the steel companies that I spoke to, particularly some of the sort of SME companies in the steel sector, I expected to find a bit more negativity, a bit more of a kind of a downbeat prognosis, a sort of, yeah, things are all right, we're struggling to get by. But actually what I found was, really a whole interesting thing about the steel sector in Sheffield, which is one of the ways that I found that it has remained competitive in a really, in an international market that's just got more and more and more competitive, is actually a lot of the advantage is using technology. There's a sort of a tech edge to it. What you're finding is a lot of companies where they're not the cheapest option. That's not what they're going to try and fight on, is we're the cheapest. What they're going to try and fight on is, we do this thing to an exact degree and we will get it right the first time. So if you have something that's very sensitive, I don't know, wind turbines, or, one example that I found from a company in Sheffield, nuclear submarines. Wow. Everything needs to be precisely, exactly, every single sort of, atom on the thing has to be absolutely bang on. And you could go with a cheaper option somewhere else, but actually what you're going to find with the Sheffield steel companies is they're just going to get it right the first time, 100% of the time. And that's their selling point. So that was really interesting. And again, the whole way that they do that is entirely technological. I mean, some of it to some extent is, you have good staff and they are very precise in what they're doing, but also a lot of it is technologically based. So that was really interesting. I found that really fascinating. Again, just something I wouldn't have known nothing about before I started coming to Sheffield and talking to people.
I don't know if we mentioned it, actually. The report is called, the name of the report is Forging Steel and Embracing Tech. Now,
That's right.
I found it quite interesting because one of the case studies within it, there's a couple of pages in the report, which is about Sheffield Tech Parks. Partly interesting because I used to work there, so I used to work for a business that was based there. But also, as we record this, the episode of this podcast next week is with Tom, who is the CEO of Sheffield Tech Park. So that caught my eye. And I was thinking about that episode, and it's strange talking about it because we've not released it yet. But one of the things that we talk about is this sort of relationship between Sheffield being the steel city and, whether the almost the shackles of whether, that past in steel holds back Sheffield kind of, moving on to something new, particularly thinking about the city centre, which has probably changed quite a lot in the time since you first visited Sheffield back in January. Like, it does feel like there's different stuff happening in the city centre now. And compared to 2-3 years ago is a lot better, but it's heading in a certain direction. And we had a discussion around this thing about, does Sheffield actually need to shake off that reputation as being the steel city? Does that need to be its past rather than being its present? So just the title of the report involving both steel and tech, I think, is really interesting in terms of, it seems to be you're saying actually those two things can both not only live together but thrive together. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think so. I think there are elements of older culture and newer culture that clash. That's just inevitable. But I think that actually the two can complement each other quite a bit. I mean, if the future of steel in Sheffield, which it seems to be to some extent, is going to be just that higher end of the market, the real precision stuff like nuclear submarines. If that's the future, well, that's going to be so much based on keeping on the cutting edge of technology. We just will be, because that will evolve. And obviously the people that you're competing against abroad, they're going to catch up, and it's going to be a constant race. So I think that, because I found a lot of the new tech, so a lot of the new tech SMEs, the startups, a lot of their initial client base will be more traditional industry. That's just an inevitable thing that they will do. So that's helping that way. And obviously the traditional industry needing to use technology to keep on the front foot. So I do think they can complement each other. I think it's something to watch for. And I think they practically dovetail quite nicely. I guess it's just more culturally how you make that work, if that makes sense.
When you first contacted me, Nick, to mention the report and to talk about the idea of coming on and chatting about it, I think your phrasing was that it's broadly positive about Sheffield. Now, what's interesting is the first couple of pages where you sort of set the scene in terms of Sheffield is probably less positive. It talks about poverty in Sheffield is higher than the national average, unemployment in Sheffield higher than the national average. You kind of look at the stats and sort of think Sheffield actually probably not doing as well as it could do. But then, as you kind of really get into the more human side of things and explore, there is a lot of positive stuff going on. So, I guess what I'm asking you really is, what other kind of really positive, really sort of forward-looking stuff about Sheffield do you want to mention?
I guess one of the things on the tech side was, I think the most positive thing was it was in my first few days in the city. I was speaking to sort of some people who had been at the tech parks, working with Tom Wolfenden. And that's how they sort of got their start. They had basically come out of uni, go into the tech parks. Then they sort of got too big for that, if that makes sense. And they kind of got their own space, usually in the city center. So usually somewhere close to Hallam campus in the city center. That was generally what I found. And hearing their stories was incredible. This sort of like these young guys who were, creating these businesses where they were already kind of making millions, that was kind of mind blowing. And also, the sort of bravado involved was, you'd hear the stories like, well, we couldn't get the venture capital in Britain. We went to London a few times, didn't really work out. So we just hopped on a plane, went to Boston. I was like, did you know anyone in Boston? Did you have contacts? No. We just kind of looked stuff up on Google and knocked on a few doors. And we came away with the investment we needed. Actually, a little bit more of the investment we needed. We were looking for 2 million. We got 3. It was great. And, hearing stories like that was like, okay, well, that's amazing. And again, just sort of, I suppose, superficially, not entirely what I expected. I think another story that I think is really interesting that I've tried to bring out through all the reports that I'm doing, not just Sheffield, but all the other regional reports that I'm doing, is, the way institutions, and particularly post-secondary institutions, sort of interact with business is really, I think, an important story. I think the 2 universities bring a lot to Sheffield in a way that I don't think gets talked about enough. And I'll give you an example. One of the ways I think that I don't think it's talked about enough is in a sort of leveling up kind of sense, which is I met a lot of entrepreneurs who were not originally from Sheffield. And their whole way that they had been introduced to the city was via going to university. It was just literally like, they tried to get into a few universities. It was like, oh, well, I got into the University of Sheffield. All right, well, that sounds all right. They had no real prior experience, and in some cases, none at all with the city. So they came and they made a whole bunch of friends. They had a good time. They made a sort of, and it was sort of like, well, I could go back to London or Bristol or Southampton or wherever. But actually, everybody I know really now in my adult life is in Sheffield.
Yeah.
So I want to start a business. Why don't I start it here? And so, you'd be there kind of in an office with someone who'd started a business, someone from Bristol or wherever who'd started a business in Sheffield by having gone to the university. And, you'd look out at the 20 people working there and go, well, that's 20 jobs in Sheffield that wouldn't really exist without this, this mechanism of bringing people into the city. I just think we're in a stage where sometimes universities kind of, I think the way we talk about them is, oh, they're expensive and they're this and, foreign students and why don't, and I just think there's a sort of negativity in a lot of quarters about post-secondary educational institutions. And I think they're really important in ways that I don't think we talk about. And then I do mean that in a very pro-business, like very actually center-rightish kind of sense, as in they are really important. And that's before we get into the whole research function and how that works, or how spin-outs work, or before we get into all that, just the basic sense that actually these universities are really kind of bringing talent in to places that actually then end up creating jobs and growth. So those are the two biggies, I think. Those are the really, really big things, where how much entrepreneurialism I found in the city was really impressive, particularly young people starting their own businesses. So, and I think that was great.
That's great to hear. I mean, I think probably some of those stories are things that we should probably be telling on this podcast. So there's a conversation to have there as well. But you're right that those of us in the city who were living this day to day probably don't stop and take stock of exactly what's happening. And the university thing's really interesting. I think having two universities in Sheffield is so important. Partly just because if you want to be that really rich multicultural city that's kind of got a lot of different things going on. Probably since you've last been here, a place called Cambridge Street Collective has opened in Sheffield, which is a food market. It's a food hall. But there's every kind of food from all over the world in there. And you kind of think, 20 years ago, I don't know if cities would be that receptive to food that they'd never tried before. So just being like a really genuine international city just feels so important for Sheffield to be the place that it feels like it should be. Obviously, you get into telling quite a few quite human stories as well within the report. Tell us a bit about Brian Rees.
Yeah, Brian was a guy, he was someone I met very early on. And I was really interested in him partly because it was a steel-based company. He makes precision medical instruments. His business is called Sheffield Precision Medical. I want to get that right, yes. And he was just an interesting guy because, he was a bit of an older guy and he'd kind of been through, all the twists and turns. And I thought one of the things that really made me want to lead off the report with his story was the fact that, when the sort of the really bad recession hit, sort of end of the 70s, early 80s in the city, he did something very counterintuitive. He didn't leave or go, okay, I'm going to be on the dole forever or whatever, anything like that. He said, well, I'm going to start my own business, which is an interesting thing to do in the face of economic downturn, I feel. I think it's really interesting. And actually, if more people did that, we'd get out of economic downturns quicker, if that makes sense. If the impulse was, oh, God, we're going into economic downturn, I better start a business. That's actually the thing that would help us get out of it. But anyway, regardless of that. So I came to his place and had a look around, and we had a really good chat. And he was great. He just sort of told me about his history, about, and it was very much a history of entrepreneurship through the years. So, you sort of start this business and you do this, and then it's actually waiting for these breaks. And actually, it was always a steel-based business, but how he got into precision medical instruments was, I won't get into all the twists and turns of it, but basically it was just sort of this happened and this happened and this happened. And then he sort of found himself like, oh, there's actually a market for this. There's an opening in this. We can do this. There you go. And also, again, he sort of feeds back into the narrative I was talking about before about the interaction between sort of traditional industry, the steel, and tech, because actually the whole point is he makes precision medical instruments. So they have to be, the whole point is they are really, really good. He's basically selling on quality, the idea that everything you're going to get from, Brian's company is going to be perfect, bang on, which was something, as you can imagine, like precision medical instruments is extraordinarily important. So it kind of just fed into everything. That's why I led off the report with it, because Brian's story kind of set the table for everything that I was sort of trying to say about the mesh of old and new in the city, about, steel and where it was going, about technology, about SMEs, and also about sort of the history of the city and where it had been and where it was going.
Yeah, it's good because I guess the temptation there would have been, you mentioned earlier about the younger entrepreneurs and those people that we probably talk about as founders nowadays. And
yes,
those kind of quite charismatic people who are super important to a city, but we forget, that there's a generation that were doing this way before kind of like, the new sort of tech founders came along.
Yeah.
And great to see that mix of stories. And that's something that feels really important to Sheffield. I've always thought Sheffield's a good city in terms of the fact that it doesn't forget about what came before. It doesn't forget about its past. It doesn't forget about its heritage. I feel we've talked a lot about the positive stuff. I've got to ask you then, what are the challenges?
I think, okay, so some of the negatives that came up, I mean, this was something I found countrywide, and it was very, very interesting. So one of the things was around transport infrastructure. I was interested to hear how many people, just without me prompting it at all, brought up the cancellation of the Birmingham to Manchester leg, which is interesting to me, because had I been in Manchester, I kind of would have been, well, okay, fair enough. But actually, it was never going to actually directly come to Sheffield. But I think people were annoyed by it for two reasons. One of which is they felt it was a sort of, a sort of snub to the north, just generally. But also, I think that because so much of the conversation in the north around transport infrastructure is just the, interconnecting the north, how difficult it is to get from a classic example of this was that I experienced myself is I in my travels, I went to Redcar, and the very next day I had to come to Sheffield for a meeting. And my whole plan was to come from Redcar back to London and then London to Sheffield. And I thought, well, hold on, what's that? I mean, I know Yorkshire's huge, but I'm in one part of Yorkshire to another. Surely there's got to be an easy way. And it turned out, no, it was a complete nightmare to try and get from Redcar to Sheffield. I mean, it was genuinely just easier to just go to London, because at least I got to spend the night with my kids and then just go back up, which is insane when you really stop to think about it. That the transport infrastructure is that bad. And so I think the thing about the HS2 thing being cancelled, it was sort of totemistic of this idea of like, Jesus, we can't build railways anymore. We can't build, a sort of what's going on with the country. And I think everybody feels like if the transport infrastructure, particularly across the north, was a lot better, that would have a direct impact on, things like foreign direct investment and all that. And, it's hard not to disagree. And it was interesting that came up again and again and again. So that was really pretty huge. I guess other challenges that came up, I mean, one was dealing with younger people coming into the workforce. And again, I got this everywhere, but I got it more in Sheffield because it's a city. You're just dealing with a higher volume of people than you would in a lot of the other places that I went, which were much smaller. But this kind of idea of actually young people coming into the workforce now, they're actually quite entrepreneurial. If you work with them, they can actually be quite brilliant and do incredible things for you. But it's very difficult to ascertain that in the way that we used to, in the traditional way. Like, for instance, a lot of young people, so we're talking like 18 to 24, let's say, can be very bad at the traditional interview. They just don't really know how to do it, right? Particularly if they are from, say, a really upper middle class background where probably they would have had some leg up with that, with their parents or their parents' network. If you're sort of particularly from lower middle class, working class background, you have kids who just come in and they just don't know what to do in an interview and are actually like quite terrible. And actually, what a lot of employers have found is gone, hang on, I think there's a spark of something with this kid. So I'm going to give them a shot. And then they've often found that actually this person's my best employee. They're absolutely amazing. And actually, they're even amazing at the things that you'd think the interview should shake out. So, for instance, like things like sales or anything person to person, anything to do with having to be presentational. Again, you'd think, well, if you were good at presentation, you'd be good at an interview. But actually, it seems like that's not really the case. So that was an interesting one. And again, I found that everywhere, but I found it a lot more in Sheffield just simply because it was a city. You're just going to get a lot more of that. I mean, I think another big one in Sheffield is people feeling like the city centre, as you mentioned, is getting so much, like the development that's going on in the city centre is quite amazing. And even the stuff that's planned is amazing. But there was a kind of complaint about like, well, like we need more, for instance, like luxury flats. That sounds like a very first world problem. But in a sense, actually, it's sort of like what I got out of that was this idea of like Sheffield getting to the next level. You're getting just to that next level where you can have, people from Silicon Valley go, you know what, let's give Sheffield a try. And with the feeling like there's just not quite yet enough of that infrastructure. And it's a difficult thing as well, because it's that thing of like, well, you build luxury flats and you kind of have to, kind of has a momentum thing. You have to feel like, the developers have to feel like they're going to sell them, right? They don't feel like there's going to be a nervousness. And it's a little bit of a catch-22, because it's like, if you don't have the luxury flats, then no one's going to buy them. But if you have them and no one buys them, so I guess it's that thing of Sheffield just getting to that next level as a city.
There's some great points there. My question really, and I guess I'm thinking specifically in terms of the report here when I ask this, because it's quite an open question, but what now? So what do you want to see happen now? What do you hope this report's going to kind of bring, and what do you want to see next?
Right. So just to kind of give you an idea where the project's going. So Sheffield is the first one that we've done. It was the first place that I went in terms of traveling around. But as I say, I've traveled around the country. I've got another report on Loughborough coming out next month. And so the interesting thing about that is actually, to some extent, having done Sheffield and then Loughborough, some of this, what I saw in Loughborough was a kind of a smaller version of what I saw in Sheffield. I mean, that's slightly unfair on Loughborough because there was also lots of things that were unique to Loughborough. But having seen the ties between the universities and the business community really prepared me for Loughborough, because then the university is so central to Loughborough, and it's really kind of almost like almost like the engine of this town. You know, it's so much flows from the university. And then I'm doing the next stages are I'm doing one on coastal communities where the main focus is on Hartlepool, which was very different. I did not meet any tech millionaires in their 20s in Hartlepool, I am sad to say. But we also do some comparisons. So I looked at Cromer in Norfolk, and I looked at Redcar, which is geographically quite close to Hartlepool, but it's actually, it's amazing. They're separated by the Tees estuary, so getting from one to the other is a total nightmare. And then I've looked at Pembrokeshire as a rural community. And again, one of the things about Pembrokeshire that was interesting was the phenomenon of rural poverty is a really interesting one. One I knew about in the abstract, but then kind of went into investigated. That was really interesting. So that's all going to be put together in a master report that we're releasing in October, where we'll kind of go through the findings of everything. I'm so glad I did Sheffield. I really, really am. I'm really glad I did Sheffield and didn't do... I'm sure I would have learned lots of stuff in Leeds or Manchester or wherever else, or Birmingham or wherever else. I think Sheffield is a genuinely interesting place that has a lot to tell us about where cities outside of London are going, and actually where they probably should go, because it is things like how does the new and the old intersect. When we were talking about negatives, I didn't really get into this too much because actually I didn't really see it myself. I only sort of heard about it because it was mentioned a few times from people. But that sort of old culture of the people who are waiting for the mills to open again, and have been long-term unemployed, and some miracle is going to happen, and all that sort of stuff. And, I didn't really see that firsthand, but it was a constant thing that was sort of brought to my attention, as it were. I think that's a generational thing, and I think that will go. I mean, it's just no doubt that the young people of today, I mean, they're just going to embrace tech, obviously, and they're going to embrace and even the people who move into the traditional industries are going to be with that mindset. So I was really fascinated with what I found in Sheffield, and I'd love to do more stuff actually in the city. If someone gave me the chance to do a bigger piece, like even an even bigger piece on Sheffield, I'd probably jump at it.
That's cool. Really interesting to kind of see you talk about, glad that you did this in Sheffield rather than Leeds or Manchester. Part of me wants to say, well, that's because Sheffield's better than Leeds or Manchester. But I've had a lot of conversations recently with people where I've said, you know what, we've got to stop doing this. We've got to stop this competition between specifically Sheffield, Leeds and Manchester, because you talk about those Silicon Valley tech, billionaires, they're not going to come to Sheffield. But if there's this kind of northern and overused phrase, northern powerhouse, but if there is this kind of, triangle between Sheffield, Leeds and Manchester, all working together with good transport links between them, the idea of, tech billionaires wanting to come here is not ridiculous. So it is about those places working together rather than being in competition with each other, because we've got a heck of a lot to offer compared to other parts of the country. And actually, once you start talking about other parts of Europe and even other parts of the world, it can really be an amazing kind of power for good for the north of England.
Just one thing on that, just very briefly. There's all this talk about we need to make sort of Oxford, Cambridge, London this sort of technology sort of triangle powerhouse. And I kept thinking, again, if you had the transport links, if you had the infrastructure for it, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, why not?
It's kind of already there, isn't it? There's just
exactly.
The transport stuff lets it down. The businesses are there. Yeah. They've each got their each distinct personality, and some are better at things than others. It's super interesting. We could talk about this for the next half hour, but we've got to wrap it up. If anyone wants to, I guess, read this report or find out more about the kind of the wider project, what's the best way for them to do that?
If you go to www.thejobsfoundation.com You can find it. It'll be there. There's a research tab. You can just see it. It's fairly easy to navigate. Port's there. We'd love to hear from people, particularly in Sheffield, about their thoughts on it. Any feedback, very gratefully received. I'm on Twitter at Nicholas Tyrone. If you want to get in touch, drop me a DM or whatever. That would be great. Thank you.
Brill. Nick, it's been a real pleasure to chat and to hear more about the report. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for listening to this episode of Steel City Business. It's been really lovely to have you with us. Now, you know how this works. If you've enjoyed it and you want in on future episodes, then just follow us on your podcast app or on YouTube. The show is very active on LinkedIn. Just search for Steel City Business and come and connect with me as well while you're at it. Big thank you to The Curious for helping make this podcast happen. There's loads more about the show at steelcity.business, and you can get in touch by emailing James at steelcity.business. And hey, if you're in business in Sheffield, then, well, why not put yourself forward as a guest for a future episode? And of course, we're always open for a good chat about how audio marketing could work for your brand. Until next time, thanks for listening.